What is your dream?
Warning: this video is made as an educational material and contains sexual health content. In this video, we will discuss in detail about the ovulation cycle and the related menstrual cycle that are part of the female reproductive system. Starting around the age of 13, after puberty or menarche, a woman undergoes cyclic changes approximately every 28 days in the ovaries and uterus, except during pregnancy. This cycle continues until around the age of 50 when menopause occurs. The changes that occur in the ovaries are referred to as the ovarian cycle, and the changes that take place in the uterus are referred to as the uterine cycle. When a female fetus is developing in her mother's womb, the germinal epithelium in the ovaries of the fetus undergoes mitosis, and around the 7th month of fetal development, approximately 10 to 20 lac oogonia, which are the primordial germ cells, are formed in each ovary, totaling around 40 lac across both ovaries. These cells are diploid, meaning they contain 23 pairs or 46 chromosomes. After birth, no new oogonia are formed or added to the ovaries. After a female child is born, the oogonial cells remain as diploid cells, which have not reached the prophase 1 stage of meiosis. They are arrested at this stage and are halted as primordial follicles until the child reaches puberty. This phase is referred to as the prolonged resting phase. After a female reaches puberty, these cells become surrounded by a single layer of granulosa cells and transform into primary follicles. Each month, approximately 20 to 25 primary follicles begin to progress to the next stages of development. Among these, only one follicle fully matures into a Graafian follicle and releases the ovum, which is the female egg cell. Let us now discuss in detail how oogenesis, egg cell formation, occurs, the associated menstrual cycle, the changes it causes in the uterus, and the role of follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH, that regulate these processes. The female reproductive cycle actually begins in the brain. The hypothalamus, a small region in the brain, secretes gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH, which acts on the anterior pituitary gland and stimulates it to release 2 gonadotropins, follicle-stimulating hormone FSH and luteinizing hormone LH. FSH enters the bloodstream and acts on the primary follicle. The primary follicle consists of a primary oocyte, which has not yet completed the prophase 1 stage of meiosis 1, and is surrounded by a single layer of granulosa cells. Under the stimulation of FSH, the primary follicle develops into a secondary follicle. The secondary follicle structure is of a primary oocyte that has not yet completed the prophase 1 stage of meiosis 1 and multiple layers of granulosa cells surrounding the oocyte. Additionally, between the primary oocyte and the granulosa cells, a layer called the zona pellucida, composed of glycoprotein, is formed. Surrounding the granulosa cells is a layer of connective tissue along with associated blood vessels, which together form the theca cells. At the same time, the FSH and LH hormones act on the granulosa cells and theca cells, respectively, stimulating them to secrete the hormone estrogen. This secondary follicle is referred to as the early secondary follicle. FSH further stimulates the granulosa cells in the early secondary follicle, causing their proliferation. Additionally, FSH initiates the formation of follicular fluid-filled spaces between some granulosa cells. This fluid contains high concentration of hyaluronic acid, which is believed to assist in the release of the oocyte. At the same time, FSH and LH continue to act on the granulosa cells and theca cells, respectively, stimulating them to produce estrogen continuously. This secondary follicle is referred to as the late secondary follicle. As FSH and LH continue to secrete and act on the secondary follicle and convert it into a tertiary follicle, The tertiary follicle is also referred to as the Graafian follicle. Let us now look at the structure of the Graafian follicle. The distinct follicular fluid-filled spaces present in the secondary follicle merge to form a single large cavity. This cavity is called the follicular antrum, which contains a high concentration of hyaluronic acid. In the Graafian follicle, the space between the vitelline membrane and the zona pellucida increases in size and is referred to as the paravitelline space. The cells present around zona pellucida differentiate into 2 or 3 layered structure called the corona radiata. The theca cells in the tertiary follicle differentiate into 2 distinct layers. The inner layer, close to the oocyte, is called the theca interna. The outer layer is called the theca externa. Even at this stage, FSH and LH continue to act on the granulosa cells, further increasing the production of estrogen. Very importantly, at this stage, the primary oocyte, which so far had not completed the prophase 1 stage of meiosis I, now finishes this phase and divides to form 2 haploid cells. One of these cells differentiates into a polar body and eventually degenerates. The other cell develops into a secondary oocyte. This secondary oocyte does not complete meiosis II immediately. Instead, it halts at the metaphase II stage of meiosis II. Only if the secondary oocyte is fertilized by a sperm cell does it complete metaphase II of meiosis II, forming 2 haploid daughter cells. One becomes fertilized to become a zygote, which eventually develops into an embryo. The other becomes a polar body, which differentiates and degenerates. The follicular phase begins typically on the 5th day of menstruation and lasts until the 14th day of the cycle, ending just before ovulation when the ovum is released. During the same period as the follicular phase, which is approximately from the 5th day of the menstruation till the 14th day, changes also occur in the uterus. These changes are driven by the estrogen hormone, which is secreted by the action of FSH and LH on the granulosa and theca cells in the ovary. Let's discuss this in detail. The endometrium is the tissue in the uterus that prepares itself for the implantation of a fertilized egg. The endometrium consists of 2 layers: the basal layer, stratum basilis, and the functional layer, stratum functionalis. The stratum basilis is the deeper layer of the endometrium, located close to the myometrium. It is the permanent layer of endometrium that does not undergo changes during the uterine cycle and helps compensate for tissue loss that occurs during menstruation. The stratum functionalis is the superficial layer of the endometrium. From the 5th day to the 14th day, this layer develops in it stroma, uterine glands, and a layer of columnar epithelium under the influence of estrogen. Additionally, spiral arteries, which supply blood to the endometrium, grow and extend deeply into this layer. During the follicular phase, follicle-stimulating hormone, by definition, stimulates the follicle, causing it to mature into a Graafian follicle by approximately the 14th day of the menstrual cycle. Once the Graafian follicle is fully matured and is ready to release the secondary oocyte, it no longer requires FSH. So, the Graafian follicle secretes a hormone called inhibin, which acts on the anterior pituitary gland, preventing it from secreting FSH. However, around the 14th day, estrogen levels peak, stimulating the hypothalamus to release more GnRH. Ideally, the role of GnRH is to act on the anterior pituitary gland and stimulate it to secrete FSH and LH. But due to the action of inhibin, FSH secretion is blocked, and only luteinizing hormone continues to be produced in large amounts. This sharp rise in LH levels occurs at around 14th day of menstrual cycle and approximately 24 hours before ovulation. The increase in LH levels cells during the mid-phase of the uterine ovarian cycle is called the LH surge. Around the 14th or 15th day, the increased secretion of LH causes the Graafian follicle to produce more follicular fluid, leading to the expansion of follicular antrum. Because of this activity, the secondary oocyte is pushed to the edge of the ovary and is ready for its release. At the same time, proteolytic enzymes break down the tissues surrounding the corona radiata, enabling the secondary oocyte to be released from the ovary into the peritoneal cavity. This process is known as ovulation. At the stage of release, the secondary oocyte is referred to as the ovum. It is important to note the unmatured developing egg cell is called an oocyte, whereas the egg cell released to be fertilized is called an ovum. The released ovum is drawn by the fimbriae present in the infundibulum region of the fallopian tube and is then transported into the ampulla, the central region of the fallopian tube. It is in this ampulla region that the ovum and sperm cells fuse as part of the fertilization process. After ovulation, the granulosa cells in the Graafian follicle accumulate a lot of lipids and yellow pigments, transforming into lutein cells. This mass of lutein cells is called the corpus luteum. In Latin, the term luteus means saffron yellow, and corpus luteum translates to yellow body. The corpus luteum is so named because of its yellow appearance. The corpus luteum functions as a transitory endocrine gland. In the female reproductive cycle, from approximately the 15th to the 28th day after menstruation, luteinizing hormone acts on the corpus luteum, stimulating it to secrete high levels of progesterone. This phase is referred to as the luteal phase. From approximately the 15th to the 28th day after menstruation, LH acts on the corpus luteum, stimulating it to secrete high levels of progesterone. If the ovum is fertilized, progesterone plays a crucial role in preparing the endometrial layer of the uterus for implantation of the fertilized egg. During this phase, blood flow to the endometrial layer increases. The spiral arteries grow further and become more coiled. The uterine glands secrete a nutrient-rich fluid containing glycogen and glycoproteins. Since the endometrium secretes various substances during this period, the events occurring in the uterus from the 15th to the 28th day are referred to as the secretory phase. At the end of the luteal phase, around the 28th day, progesterone exerts a negative feedback control on the anterior pituitary gland, preventing the secretion of both FSH and LH. However, if fertilization and implantation occur, the endometrial tissue, to support the developing embryo, must maintain its structure, continue providing blood supply, and secrete various nutrients. For this to happen, a continuous supply of progesterone is required for the endometrium. The embryo, by itself, secretes a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, which acts on the corpus luteum and stimulates it to produce progesterone and maintain the endometrial lining. The corpus luteum continues to secrete progesterone until the placenta forms, which is approximately 3 months into pregnancy. After placenta is formed, the corpus luteum degenerates. The developing fetus receives the necessary nutrients through the placenta. If the oocyte is not fertilized and implantation does not occur by approximately the 28th day after menstruation, the corpus luteum completely degenerates and transforms into corpus albicans, a type of scar tissue, which then disappears completely. This degeneration leads to the halt of progesterone secretion. In the absence of progesterone, the spiral arteries in the stratum functionalis layer of the endometrium begins to rupture, bleed, and undergo constriction. The uterine glands stop functioning and stop secretion, and the stromal cells too begin to break down. Continuous bleeding results in the formation of blood clots, depriving the stratum functionalis tissues of required oxygen. This leads to necrosis, cell death in the affected tissues. During this time, the hormone prostaglandin stimulates myometrium contractions, which help expel blood, tissues, uterine secretions, and degenerated cells from the stratum functionalis layer. This expulsion process is called by different names, including menses, menstruation, or periods. This shedding of blood and uterine lining typically lasts for about 3 to 5 days and is referred to as the menstrual phase. The first day of menstrual bleeding marks the first day of the female reproductive cycle. For a woman, from puberty to menopause, excluding the times of pregnancy, the ovulation cycle and menstrual cycle continually recur every 28 days.
You have to excel in the education.